Okay, here we go. Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to see so many people here this morning. We have a guest today, Keith Clark, who is a dear friend of all of us. And I'm going to pass you over to Craig to give you a little bit of background on Keith and set the session for this morning.
Good morning. This is going to be a wonderful session. Keith Clark is probably one of the most renowned people I know of in the area of afterlife communications in ITC. He certainly is a hard worker and is a pioneer in the field. And his iDigital Medium is one of the best outlets for information about the ITC and afterlife communication. So it's always a pleasure to have Keith. I have great admiration for him. And so looking forward to seeing what you have to say, Keith.
Thank you, Craig, and hello to everybody. It looks like we have an experienced group. I can see that because half the emails were already in there before we were told. So that told me most of you have already been in meetings more than I had. So thank you for the time and the opportunity to be here. I'm still practicing with my public speaking, and you'll see that present. And I'm actually expressive of that because it will help me into the future. My time looking at screens and working on computers and not as much time talking to people. So it's hard to express what's actually going on. So what I would like to do is give it a overall view of the big picture of ITC and what it actually is, to clear up a few misconceptions, and then to express what that means to us today. Now, it would take a lot of time to rewrite the history of ITC as it is. And the reason for that is it's comprehensive, and each day it's growing. So what I would like to do is refer to some of the resources that are already out there. And I'm going to share my screen. I know it might be a little corny, a little less professional, but I will simply admit that I haven't had the time to create a formal presentation. I would rather demonstrate it to you as you, in the same manner that you would go out and look for it yourself. So give me 1 second here. Go ahead and share my main screen and my audio. Screen 2. Some of you may be aware of these resources, some of you may not. Currently on the screen, let's see. Who's not muted? Winnie, is my screen good? Can you see it?
Your screen's good. Yep.
Okay, thank you. The site we are currently on is worlditc.org. For at least 2 decades, this website, which was created by a gentleman named Mark Macy and another gentleman he worked with, was pretty much the flagship for information about ITC. In fact, it still is. There is more information on this website than there are all the other websites combined still to this day. And so on that website, since Mark Macy was personally involved with a lot of the people, and he took on the role of documenting what was going on, his chronicle of ITC and how it developed is likely to be one of the most correct. ITC was not a term that was coined until many years later. It actually started with EVP, electronic voice phenomena. So on the page of Mark Macy's website, which is worlditc.org, it's one of his many websites. It gives us a description of how people recorded sound and they noticed voices with shamans is the first section in 1901. And I'm just going to give a general, I'm going to skim over it, just like you would if you were to research. In 1910, there is a field here where it describes how some more instances were recorded in the church. There are references to Thomas Edison and how he thought it would be a good idea to be able to record voices of people that transition or pass on. And there are other continuing developments, but when it really started to change was when people of influence had an experience and they were able to bring it to the general public. And that one time was when a gentleman by the name of Friedrich Jurgensen, who was a film producer, I could show pictures, but it would delay me in my explanation. He was a film producer, which meant he was connected. Being connected, he had an experience where he was recording bird songs on cassette, on tape. And in playback, he heard voices. It interested him. He was obviously the creative type, and so he continued on, and he began to record more and more. Being the popular person that he was, word of his discovery spread, and then other people began to be involved and began to look into it. Mr. Jurgensen wrote a book, which is still available for free today, which is certainly also another monumental contribution. The second most major thing that happened was another gentleman heard of Friedrich Jurgensen's experiences of recording voices that were calling him by his name, his pet name actually, and his name was Dr. Konstantin Rudebe. Now, I'm sure you've heard his name. He's a very popular man. He still visits physical mediumship seance circles to this day. He has appeared in telephone calls. He's appeared on television screens, and a lot of people in this present day believe his work, that he is influencing their current work. What he did that made it different, that took it to a whole another level, was he recorded 72,000 voices. He was pretty serious about it. He was a psychologist, so he had the professional credentials to back up his work. He published the samples, he published books, he pretty much went all in. And then it started to take hold. More people started to become aware and do their own experiments. Around the same time in the 70s, there's another gentleman that's very well known. His name is George Meek. He had invented some patents for air conditioning and some other things. He had an interest in spirituality and topics like that. And so when he retired, he dedicated his life towards work with spirit, towards research. He was trying to understand consciousness. Do we die? What happens? And his work just evolved. He would go out and fly somewhere and dig into what was really happening. There were healings in Brazil. He would look at different mediums and he would assess what's real, what isn't, what's happening here, and what can we learn from it. In a lot of ways, the work of George Meek and the company, the organization that he founded called Metascience Foundation, is responsible for probably a good 70 to 80% of the growth of ITC that we have seen. They were organized as a business. I don't know the exact number of years, but it was a long time. It was probably 2 decades. During that 2 decades, they were involved in a lot of work, a lot of it which most people don't even know existed. We'll come back to that in a minute. One of the things you may have heard of was Spiritcom. There was a gentleman that had mediumistic abilities. And when George Meek worked with them, there was a point in time in which voices came through tones through a radio transmitter experiment. And that was such a big deal to George Meek and the Metascience Foundation that they held a press conference, a real live press conference on TV. However, they never found the exact support that they were looking for. One thing I want to mention before we continue is a little caveat. I'm going to go down all these little side streets that aren't usually mentioned or talked about. With everything out there in the world that we discover, there's always some that's real and some that's not real. This is normal. It applies to different forms of mediumship. It applies to a lot of different areas. And all I'm saying by that is that there's never a case where everything that is presented is exactly what it is presented as. So we can't necessarily always make judgments on things that occurred in the past. However, we look at the history of what happened, who was involved, did we learn from it, what effect did it have, and how can we grow from it? So while there may be some doubt as to whether Spiritcom was real, as to whether some of these other contacts were real, we need to read between the lines and look at the overall picture of where we are as humanity and see how that changed. So now you've got all these little pockets of individuals. You got people in Europe, you've got people here in the United States, you've got some people in Brazil who are very active. And they started to form groups. A lady that is also largely responsible, her name is Sarah Estep. She said she recorded, I didn't want to say religiously because that's the wrong word, but she recorded EVP for years. So EVP, electronic voice phenomena, that is the name given to voices that appear when you record sound. And those voices are obviously not the voice of anyone that is physically present. That is how this all began, and it continued that way for decades. And EVP is the most widely known form of communication. EVP is where it all started, and EVP is often confused with ITC. So let me explain. So EVP was first, and EVP is recording a voice in sound. Oftentimes when people would record, they would not hear the voice with their ears when they recorded. For example, if I said, hello, is anyone there? I have the tape recorder recording. I don't hear anything, but then when you play it back, you hear voices, which were usually short, they were usually hard to hear, and that is pretty much a well-known phenomenon at this point. It's real, it's definitely real. And so then that began to expand. So Sarah Estep created an organization called the American Association of Electronic Voice Phenomena. Now, being from the United States, it's clear that most of my historical perspective is going to be a slight favoritism towards the United States, only because that's what's in my consciousness. It's easier for me to digest and to remember. There were things that happened in Europe also that were starting to get very interesting. There were contacts that were happening in Europe, in Luxembourg, by Jules and Maggie Harsh-Fischbach. They received computer messages on screens. They received pictures. There were all kinds of things going on, different experimenters. There was one named Klaus Schreiber. He recorded voices on his television. I would like to show one of those just because it is so awesome. I think it's worth taking a look at. Okay. I like pictures. Everybody likes pictures as much as we like voice. Pictures are pretty cool because they have a different connotation of what is the mystery. Who is the person? Is it the person I'm trying to communicate with? And there's a fascination to that I think is amazing. Here's an example of a video and how this experiment would, faces would appear on people's TV screens. And the way they would do this is they would do a certain type of experiment where they would point the video camera at the TV. And the TV would send out a signal and go back into the camera. That's actually the other way around, but the point is it was a feedback loop. It was constantly going in an energetic loop. Whatever you would see on the screen would go back into the camera, it would go back to the TV, and then it would go back. The camera would see it again. I'm going to demonstrate a video like this, just to show what it looks like. And this is each frame of a TV changing one frame at a time to produce the picture of Albert Einstein. I'd have to check my dates, but this was not recently. This is not 2000s, 1990s. This was back probably in the 80s. What are we, 30 years now? It's a long time. And so all across the board, all these little things started popping up, and they were all phenomenal. They were all magical. They were all unique and so fantastic that they were difficult to believe. Pictures from the other side. Like I said, for me to reproduce this history that's already present on Mark Macy's website, I don't think it's something that would be beneficial to the community at this time. If you have not been on this website, you cannot have a conversation about ITC without Mark Macy's World ITC website. That goes without saying. Okay, so there's a gentleman by the name of Professor Ernst Sinkowski. He decided to give this a name. Since we are receiving communication, we're receiving it through electronic devices. And so he came up with the term, when translated to English, was called Instrumental Transcommunication. Being that we were using devices or technology to provide a venue or a place for these people to try to communicate with us from other places, other dimensions, wherever it is that they are. Another big event that started to change was in 2005 when the movie White Noise came out. Now, I know some of you may not have seen it, but it had Michael Keaton in it. It was not that exceptional of a movie. And it was actually a horror movie. It was actually not something that we would not look at and say, this is beneficial to ITC. And in that movie, they reference hearing voices after someone had died. That movie catapulted EVP into the stratosphere. And when it did that, the amount of people that were interested in instrumental transcommunication multiplied by a factor of at least 100. And to this day, we're still experiencing that effect. And it's gone up into two sections. There is EVP and what it meant to the people that experiment with instrumental transcommunication, and there's EVP and how the paranormal world perceived it. Paranormal world is a term derived by the general public, which does not indicate the intention or desire to communicate. The difference between the word paranormal and ITC is done with intent. It's done on purpose. We do this action to communicate with people in other places. Paranormal tends to be often the accepted public term, but it tends to be, here's this mystery, we don't know how it works, how does it work? And so that's why there's a difference between the outcome of what happened in both communities. Instrumental transcommunication already had the back history that we're presenting today, in which Mark Macy has taken the time to present. So we understand why it happens. It's a desire on the behalf of someone like us to communicate with someone else. Now, the desire is not exactly always necessary. There's also some science involved to this. But before we get to that, I just wanted to describe and express why is ITC separate from paranormal. And as we see, so then the ghost shows started to come out around the 2000s, early 2000s. First it was one, and then it was another, and then it just became this whole slew. And they would play EVP. EVP was the flagship. And they started to bring in different meters and different things that would sense energy. But they were missing a very important element, which is the education of what is it, why is it? Now, hauntings, poltergeists, things of this nature, I do not have much experience in them, so I wouldn't attempt to try to describe how they play into this picture overall. I would just say that it's all energy. And what's happening now is the entire world is starting to change the way we look at energy. So, to recap here in a second before we change train tracks, ITC started to blossom, it started to grow. There were people everywhere. They were excited, interested, and often people tend to get frustrated too. Why can't I connect to the exact person I'm trying to connect with? Or why doesn't the world know that this is true? Why is it being held back? Why is it being suppressed? Why? And we are still going through those kind of throes to this day of those growing pains, trying to figure out what's going on. To summarize it all, I would say that where we are at in the present day and what this means to you and what I would like to convey before you ask your questions is I would like to give you my definition of ITC and what it means in the personal experience. It's not necessarily a technical thing. A true relationship with ITC is actually understanding that everything's energy. For example, everything in this room, everything around me, everything where you're sitting, none of it's empty. When people ask you, is a glass half full or is a glass half empty? It's neither. It's always full. Everything is full, always has been. As we look around, there is not a single space. There is no such thing as space. Space does not exist. And if we look at things from that simple perspective, we start to understand how some of these contacts work. Meaning they're not somewhere else. They're not in a faraway place. There is no distance between here and there. If I'm touching my hand here, or touching my hand there, or touching my hand here, it's all the same because with my intent, I've touched my hand. And so once we begin to open up our minds and realize that if we have the intent to communicate, we have the desire, but most of all, if we have the persistence Any single one of us, no matter who you are, no matter if you exercise or practice as a medium, no matter whether you've never done anything technical at all or you can barely turn on your computer, it does not matter who you are, what degree of understanding that you have. It does matter how your consciousness has developed and evolved. But what we have seen is anyone that is open to miracles will create miracles. And that's what ITC is. ITC presents itself as miracles. We focus on something, we pay attention to it, or we create it. We create it with our minds. And when we do that, there are a lot of spiritual lessons that we're here to learn, which is how does this world around us really work? I'm going to say some things that are going to kind of go against the grain a little bit, and they're coming from my personal experience. But our mental idea of what ITC is changing. ITC is actually going to evolve to where we just call it science. It's got a name until we understand it, and then it's just going to be, well, that's life, and that's the way it is. It helps us evolve spiritually. Everything we do will help us understand more of who we are and what's possible. And with that, I would go ahead and like to close and turn it back to either Craig or Wendy and see what questions you have so we can help figure out, well, open to see what your thoughts are and to see what does this mean to us? What can we do today? That's where we'd like to go. All right, I'll turn it back to you, Craig or Wendy.
Great. Keith, can you stop sharing your screen?
Yes, I will.
That's great.
I stopped. I know it wasn't that exciting. I didn't flash through a bunch of pictures.
Keith,
I could have. I could have kept you here for 3 hours, but I chose to express through speech. Okay, Wendy.
I think that gives us a great overview, and we'll come back in a little while just to hear your own personal experiences. But I'd just like to throw it open to others. Does anybody else have experiences of ITC or EVP? Sherry, can we just quickly, can we hear from you?
Am I unmuted?
You are.
Okay, and let me say that my little baby grandsons may walk in the door any minute, so if I leave early, it's only because I'm involved. But of course, those who know me know that in 2016, I started experimenting with recording EVPs. I had heard Mark Macy speak in 2006, but I didn't have a son in spirit at the time, and I had small children in the home, and I will admit that at that time it scared me, the whole idea of it. I had some more years to put in, and when I finally heard about it, when it came back to my mind again, it was through the Big Circle. I watched the documentary Calling Earth, and I saw about these parents that were connecting with their children. And so I tried to get in touch with the Big Circle, but at that time someone got back to me and said they weren't recording. And it just went on the back burner until one day on the radio interview, Vicki Talbot heard me talk about my prayer registry, and she contacted me to register her son Braden, and we got to talking, and Vicki had been recording EVPs for 15 years by then. And so she got me started, her and Craig Hogan, who was a wonderful help in providing me with background sound and listening to my early recordings and pointing out things to me that I did not hear initially. A lot of it is training your ear initially to hear EVPs and learning how to play with the recording and slow things down so that you can more easily hear them. But thanks to Keith, who a lot more than giving the history of EVP, this man is an experimenter and a pioneer in making sound sources for us. Keith mentioned that these people in spirit are not speaking to us through their mouths, and because they don't have mouths to speak through, it's really done by thought. We provide a background sound, which some people have referred to as white noise, and spirit somehow can influence that sound with thought into words that we can hear. And that's why we more often hear it on playback, because we have the time to go by, as I would do, second by second, until I heard words I recognized. But then Keith, he made sound sources that are just purely electronic sound. They're not, they have no human vocal gibberish in them. And so I now have a line in which I can hear 100% of the words that are being spoken, but it's not as easy for others to hear as the human vocal gibberish. Wendy fortunately helped me name this as electronic assisted clairaudience, because I don't know how I hear these words, but my spirit team tell me that they're not sure that anyone else necessarily would. But what's really interesting, and it's taught me a lot, is that if I want to ask a question to my spirit team or whoever's communicating, I just have to think it. And when I think it, I hear my thoughts in the sound source. So to me, it's more or less this thing Keith created. It's like a line that picks up sound from thoughts, from our side, from my mind, and from their thoughts. And it just it makes them audible. At least I know one other person I sent it to, Keith, this one man who said, yes, he can hear his daughter using what Keith calls Michael. That's the name he gave it. But it's fascinating because this line is able to just let our thoughts embed the sound with words that we can, at least in this sound source, I can hear. Also, I have used human vocal gibberish quite a lot. Sonia Rinaldi at one time sent me some human vocal gibberish made in Portuguese from a little boy who speaks Portuguese. And I asked my son, if I use this, can you speak in English? And I have an EVP, I could probably pull it up if you want. That's very, very clear, where you hear it say, I speak in English. So they can translate, they just need sound. And then they can use thought to influence the sound. If you're going to begin trying this, I always recommend the human vocal gibberish, because it really does create a more human sounding EVP, whereas what I listen to now sounds definitely more like a robot. So, that's because it's just coming from electronic sound with no human vocal within it. But the whole field is absolutely fascinating. I've also learned through my experience that prayer is important. Vicki Talbot's son calls it the 3 Ps: prayer, protection, and permission. I didn't take that seriously. I was cocky, and I thought my son and my spiritual healer, Harry Edwards, would naturally protect me. And there is something in the field, it's documented, they're called imposters. But there are some energies that have a good time, if they can, playing with our heads. It's a party line. It's not a person-to-person call. So you have to not do this if you've been out drinking. It's not a parlor game. You're making a phone call to the other side, and it's like you're in the dark. The voice you can't recognize, and you can't see the person. So you must use discernment and know by the type of things they say or the kind of energy you feel who you may be talking to. So it's not a game. It's a serious business. On the other hand, I agree with Keith. It's a total miracle. We are communicating through the veil of what my team calls the veil of vibrational differences. And Keith's absolutely right. From what I'm told, it's not that it's far away. It's just that it's a different vibratory, they're on a different vibratory frequency. So we can't perceive them, but it's right here. So if we give them the right sound and we record it with the vocal gibberish, I would have to play it back to hear it. But when I go on my line now, I do my prayers. I have a whole ritual I do, and I make sure I'm surrounded with light and full of light. And then I just go on, and they'll just say, this is your spirit team. We take it from there. So I encourage anyone that wants to try to give it a try, because it's not about the technology. I am really no genius when it comes to technology, but it is about the desire to do it and putting in the time. It takes time, but it's a miracle. And I thank Keith and I thank Craig for helping me get started. He encouraged me so much, because we are rare birds, and we're a rare breed, all of us, and we need to support each other in this. And when I got into trouble with that, I call them the leg for the lower entity group, Wendy was very wise in advising me. I mean, we need to stay together, because we are pioneers if we're going to do this, which means that we may be going where others haven't gone. So we need each other, and I thank everyone here who's given me support. I intend to stay with it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sherry. That's great. Okay, questions. Sorry.
Yeah, Sherry. Sherry,
Yeah.
Can you give everybody your website?
Yes, I think it's important we do this.
Sherry has the training.
Yes, I have at my website a free slideshow made for both Macs and PCs. The screen is split down the middle, and it's totally free, and it will lead you through all the steps you want to follow to configure your computer to record EVPs. And then there's a link to a YouTube video I made, which will demonstrate how to make a recording. So if you want to find this, you just go to sherrypearl.com. That's SHERIPERL.com. And when you get to the welcome page, you'll know you're there. You'll see a picture of me. Scroll down on the left-hand side of the welcome page. There's a search bar. Scroll down to where it says the EVP line. Hit on that, and you'll be into the instructions on how to get started.
Fantastic. Questions, comments? Anybody like to share something? Marion, thank you.
Hello. I just got to ask one question, because something very strange happened to me about 4 years ago. I was on my computer upstairs. We got a computer room, and I was just sitting, going through all my my emails, and I got one email. I didn't know who it was from, and it was from a man in Denmark. And I was reading it, and I went, "Dear Paul," and I went, "Paul," and I kept reading, and it was he wrote in Danish that he has been to his father's funeral, and he sort of put his fist up and saying, "I wonder if there's life after death," and just said, "I'll see you in the summertime, have a good time, funeral went well." And then it just went, "Love, Jens." And I went, "Well, who's Paul and who's Jens?" So I went over to try to double check the email address, and an email was sent from Denmark to a man that was Danish in Birmingham, but ended up on my site in London, who I'm also Danish. So I actually tried to write back to the man who sent it to me, who stood with his fingers up and says, "Why have you got it?" I said, "I have got no idea, but I've got it in front of me." But the same man came from the same town in Denmark and only lived when I was a child about 10 doors further down. What is that then? I mean, how can you get an email that wasn't even sent to me? They're supposed to have gone to Birmingham to somebody up there called Paul. How did I ended up getting it?
Are you asking me or Keith or?
Anyone.
Well, I will just say that they play around and it's a lot of fun. So sometimes sometimes I do believe our friends on the other side do and can manipulate equipment to get something into someone's hands who can be of help, who might be able to, help that person, but I mean, all quirky stuff happens for sure.
Yeah. This never happened before, and I could never work that one out at all. I could never. And then I tried to get in contact with the man, Paul, up in Birmingham, but the address was jumping back, so I just couldn't get hold of him. For me, that was just very strange. The whole lot was very strange.
Yeah.
And another thing I also have done, which is also very interesting, I was on the Danish radio, And there was only me and the guy who was doing the interview with me, and it was over Easter, and he was quite religious, and he wanted to know what
Grandkids are here. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
And he wanted to know what kind of, where does my work fit into Easter situation and that kind of thing. And we just had a chat for about half an hour. He took all his equipment with him back to his studio, and he sat there. And actually, we had an incredible EVP coming on, because I was just turning around and saying, well, and explaining a little bit about, my work and myself. And suddenly another voice comes over. It was a Danish woman with a very posh Copenhagen accent. And all she said were, oh, well, Marion, she can. That was what it said. And a whole nation actually heard that one. And he just said, he sat like this, and he said, I haven't touched it. There was other people there. We sat on the 7th floor. There was nobody, no windows open, no nothing. And that was quite interesting to have all the words string together. I think that's actually fantastic. And another time that happened was I actually went to see David Thompson. And in our own physical circle, we were sitting, and we were just afterwards talking about what we have seen. And somebody was talking about, there was a very strange lady there, and we were just talking about this strange lady. When we actually heard the tape back again, there was another woman that turned around and said, oh, you mean the lady from Brazil with the dark hair?
Fantastic stuff. Fantastic.
so these are, but this has never been just one little word, ever. Everything I ever had with the EVP has always been long sentence. It has been whole words. It hasn't just been, that's supposed to be John. It has nothing to do with that.
It certainly seems that there is a very strong relationship between physical mediumship and EVP. Keith, would you like to speak to that? Because the Bachi voices are the perfect example of that. But do all of you know about the Bachi voices? Keith,
no.
Maybe Keith can explain it to you.
Thank you, Wendy. Actually, that's a great topic to talk about, because that's what ITC is. Actually, when it first came out, we were looking at it as technical. Now we realize, well, it's not just technical. It's some technical and it's some mediumship, kind of. That's pretty much what it is. It's a blending of the two. One complements the other. So there's a gentleman that what's the word? Not idolize. That's the wrong word. I aspire to have characteristics that are similar to a gentleman in Italy. His name is Mr. Marcello Bacci. And in the 40s, he began tuning his radio, and he would hear voices. He had one of those old shortwave radios where you sit there and you turn the knob, and it's unclear what exactly his history was. How did he develop this? Why did he do it? Because he apparently started before it became even known. But what he did is he sat in front of his radio, and he would turn it, and he would hear voices. And so he would turn the knob, and you hear radio stations go, blah, blah, blah. And as he turned it, Spirit would take that energy of all those radio stations that he passed, form it into words, and all of a sudden they would hear a sentence coming through the radio that would have a very strange method of speech. And so the reason why we're starting to link, before I got far, people came to Mr. Bacci's house for decades. And they also have a center in Italy where they have rows and rows and rows of chairs. And mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters all went there, and they sat to hear Mr. Bacci and his radio. And it started in the 40s. We don't know when people started coming to his house in the center, but it was definitely a long, long time ago. There's a documentary about him on YouTube, and it has English subtitles. And in that documentary, you will see where they describe how appors appear around Mr. Bacci. So in physical mediumship, seances, an apport is when, or apport, depending on how you pronounce it, is when a physical object materializes and appears in our physical vibration, but it originated somewhere else. And as they were filming this documentary, items would appear on Mr. Bacci's shoulder and other places. And it was common for roses to appear and just fall from nowhere, similar to what happens in physical mediumship. Now, I imagine there's a cultural difference in Italy. We don't know as much as we want to know about Mr. Bocci. Some very renowned people went over there one time to Italy to visit him, and they took the tubes out of his tube radio. And the radio should not have continued to be able to produce any sound, yet the voices continued. So anything with ITC, what we're learning is very simple. EVP usually tend to be short words, maybe 2 or 3. And I think that we heard those and we would always say, oh, that's everything. I think they're actually talking nonstop 24/7, and we only hear the spikes of energy that happen to make it into our audible range. I believe that there is a nonstop, never-ending stream of consciousness fully available 24 hours a day, that it's not just a little burst of energy. The EVP was only literally the tip of the iceberg. And so we're starting to see it in some ways as a form of mediumship. And that's why Sherry can experiment and another person can experiment, and they can get different results that are unique to them. And that's my description of that.
Thank you, Keith. That's really wonderful. In a minute, Keith, do you have a little bit of the, can you get the Konstantin Radovis phone call to Mark Macy? I think we could play that, because talk about soul phone. When we have a conversation, a 17-minute conversation between a person in spirit and an experimenter here, even if we just have the first minute or so of that, that would be wonderful. But yes, there is definitely a connection between physical mediumship and the mediumship. Now, the lady that we have on next week, Dr. Annabella Cardoso, does what Bocci does. She's been the leading light in ITC in Europe for a good 20 years. She's a fascinating lady. She's a Portuguese diplomat, and she represented Portugal in various countries. She also speaks several European languages, so she has that advantage as well. And for many, many years, she has run the ITC journal. If you Google it, you can find the ITC journal. All of the past volumes are online, or you can purchase them. But she has also written a wonderful book, ITC, and her talk is going to be about what we learn about the spirit world from ITC. So we're very, very fortunate to have Annabella with us. She's also an animal rights crusader. So she did say it would depend on whether her animals will allow her to come on. Apparently she has a house full of rescue animals. So that's our topic for next week, and that was the connection for next week. Does anybody have a question? Just put your hand up like that, and I can see you. Kathleen, over to you.
Hi, Keith. I have a question about any experience you may have, or experiences that have been shared with you about spirits that might take over a computer. Where is there a tip on how to tell whether or not maybe you've been hacked, or if you sit and watch the screen and the little mouse is moving and documents are opening and closing? If there's a tip that you could share on how often that happens, or if that's ever happened to you. If it could be spirit or just a hacker, I don't know, but it's happened to me.
Sure. Well, for computers, that's my profession. So naturally, one of the first things I do, I am kind of analytical. I'm hopeful and analytical. I'm hopeful that it is spirit, but I'm analytical in the sense of how did this happen? Mm-hmm. So I would say the easiest way to determine that is to repeat it. Just because anything that is energetic, anything that can be created can be reproduced. Does that mean that one-offs don't happen? Of course not, miracles do. But personally, do I have anybody physically changing computers? I do not. But they change the bits and bytes in the computers. I am pretty confident that they change the actual data inside my computer. I can't prove it yet, but I didn't show you guys any of the wow stuff like pertaining to me. Perhaps at the end, we'll show you a couple of cool things that may blow your mind. I just wanted to give a perspective. As far as computers, it has been documented where they have changed things after they've already been recorded.
Okay.
Remember, hard drives are just magnets. That's all they are.
Well, what happened in my case, and this was before I got interested in the afterlife, my mouse was bouncing all over, and I picked up my cell phone, and I have about 2 minutes of recording of my screen. And one document in particular kept opening and closing. And then it's a Mac, under the menu where it says recent documents opened, it never showed that it opened. And it was a document I had prepared for someone on tips for healing MS disease and diet. And it just kept opening and closing and opening and closing. And then the mouse would go to the corner. And I thought, well, maybe some spirit is interested in that information to share. I don't know. But the fact that it didn't appear in the recent document menu opened is the question that I might have for you. If that ever happens, people open and close documents and then there's no record of it.
Well, I would say there's a couple things I need to say. Number one is it was your personal experience. And I found that as I go through life, I realized you can never discount anybody's experience. I've seen some of the craziest things. I know it. The world is not as we think it is. So there's two things we got to do. Number one, it's easiest just to hope that it will repeat again. Because if we close our mind and say, oh, that wasn't real, we just might have closed the door for that to happen again. There are people who get text messages. There are on phones. There are people who get messages on computers. Some of them happen to be physical mediums, which is interesting. And I have seen in the past where our energy can affect electronics. For example, I've seen cases where something was playing, audio, and I heard something. Because I heard it, I got excited. Because I got excited, it got stronger. And this whole little cycle started. So what I would say is, if I took the technical perspective, I would say, if I looked at the evidence that you have provided verbally, the only thing I could say is, hopefully you would ask for it to happen again. But what's more important is to have both mentalities at the same time. This could be real, I'm open to it, but I'm not sure, hey, let's make something happen. Those are pretty much the two. It's not really black and white like people think it is.
Thank you. Thank you. That's helpful.
You should, what you're doing is, if you are having a dialogue, it's with an intelligence, it's with a being that is intelligent. So you should start a dialogue and find out who that is. Say, you know, who is it that's trying to speak to me, or what are you trying to say to me, or you know, what is the reason for this, or can you do that again if you want me to respond to it? And start a dialogue, because you can have an interaction with whoever it is. And if you get nothing, then you can just let it go and say, as Keith says, just be open-minded about it. But it could possibly be just the computers, you know, because they have a mind of their own. But have a dialogue, start a dialogue, and any encounter with what you believe to be an entity or a person from another realm, then start the dialogue and ask them who it is, ask them what they want, ask them if they would do that again, and they will respond if they are in fact somebody who's trying to connect with you.
And there's one other little detail. Don't forget, all computers are electrical connections, just like our brain. When I just moved my hand, I just sent a signal from here to here and I moved it. When you work on a computer, you're running programs that tell it how to send those electrical connections. But what I'm saying is, this can affect the computer. We haven't seen it yet. I can't prove it, but I'm going to tell you that this is electrical connection. The computer's electrical connection. We will come to find that anything is possible. So some people may just want to sit on their computer and try to have things like that happen. It is possible, but we have to be able to separate it in the future from, you know, we have to be able to prove it. Here's the data that went in. Here's the data that went out. It got changed. Who changed it? And that's where we'll move forward in that area.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you, Susan Barnes. Oops.
some evidence on your comment that EVP works with physical phenomena, because we had a situation 3 summers ago here at my place where we had a group of about 30 people, and my friend Donna Hogan Sinclair was doing EVPs, and the equipment went crazy. I mean, for some reason they were trying to get it to stop. They tried to turn it off, it didn't work. They unplugged it, it was working. And in the equipment, the voice had said knock, 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 and then in the EVP you actually heard the knocks, like the Fox sisters in it. And so we played it back, and it was very, very clear that the EVP said knock, 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 and then you heard knock, knock, knock. And Donna took it back to the guy who wrote the EVP program, and he said it was impossible for those knocking sounds to be in the tape, because those types of sounds were not programmed into the system. So, I mean, to me, that one was a great, great example of physical mediumship and EVP. So went back to the Fox sisters.
Thanks, Susan. Somebody else? Marion?
I just want to ask Keith, when we talk about the man in Italy, Marcello, his name was,
Yes.
Is there anybody else that is experimenting with his sort of kind of radio and might be getting the same sort of result as what he has?
Excellent question, and thank you for bringing it up, because I missed a lot of points. What's special about your guest next week is she's one of the few people in the world that have worked with radio. So EVP is the most common, where you used to be tape recorders, now it's digital. But radio requires a different kind of patience. Radio often requires it to be on for extended periods of time, because the longer it's on, the more people in spirit can work with it. So Marcello Bacci is probably the most well-known. Annabella Cardoso, who you'll be talking to next week, is the second most well-known. Sonia Rinaldi has done some work with radio, but she's moved on to new methods. I have my own version where I've been streaming a radio since 2006 or 7, but mine is unique to me, to where I take a radio, I remove the noise live. That means I take the static and I make it less static. And then I restream it out to the world, to you, where any of you can listen to it anytime, 24 hours a day. What you'll hear is this mess of noise where you think you hear voices, but you're not quite sure. And sometimes they'll come out louder than other voices. So mine is different. Mine is totally computer related. Annabella Cardoso, who again is next week's guest, has documented messages. She has documented recordings. She worked with a group called Rio de Tiempo. So in English translation was Time Stream. And they said that they were a station that was specifically set up to work with her. And not as many radio as there are EVP. There are paranormal people that took radios, and you know how Mr. Bacci, he turned the knob manually. Well, there were technical people such as Frank Sumption and another fellow named Joe that figured out if you could make the radio tune by itself, you would hear voices forming in that energy. Now, the reason why that method is not proposed to be that successful in ITC is because you're listening to voices that are already there, so it's hard to distinguish the additional voices from the voices that are already there. But that is a big thing that took off, and there's probably a couple thousand people working on that. But as far as radio, turn it on, set it and forget it, or sit there and focus and meditate on it, Mr. Bacci is retired. Currently, I think I've written to Dr. Cardoso. She can tell you next week. I don't think she's using the radio as much anymore, which leaves my radios. And if you ever want to listen to it yourself, you can. It's live, it's real time, and I'll give you a link right now. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Thank you.
It's very rare.
Okay, Keith, could you play a little bit of that phone call? Because I think this, to me, it was one of the most exciting things that really got me going on afterlife research, when you hear the potential of this kind of thing, you know, this is way, way before the cell phone. This is like 40 years ago. And listening to these phone calls was incredible.
Definitely. And also, there's something to note. People like Wendy and myself and others in the community have referred to these phone calls over the years because Mr. Rudiva, as he pronounced it, came through at a seance for myself back somewhere around 2010. He's come through seances for Sonia Rinaldi. He's come through for Tom and Lisa Butler of A-Trans. And we've heard his name pronounced a lot of different ways, but here is a sample of a phone call. He called not one, but several different people during the heyday of ITC, I believe in the early 90s, if I'm not mistaken. Go ahead and share over here. Share primary screen. After that, Wendy, I'd like to show a couple photos, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah. You take over then and tell us about your work.
Screen. Resonance. All of the things that you will listen to and hear will be on this website. I need to reshare, make sure I check audio. Okay, it's good. This is an excerpt of a phone call from Mr. Konstantin Rudiva after this transition to Mark Macy, who was alive here in the United States.
The system on my side. Do these things sound like a good? Sure, very good.
We need to be able to hear it. I have to play it a different way.
The system on my side. Do these things sound like a good?
And that's not working for me, Wendy.
Okay, that's fine. Well, people can have a look at it themselves. He's got some wonderful tapes on that site. He's also got some wonderful videos of the spirit world of people on his other site. He's got a site called The Beacon, Mark Macy, The Beacon, and he has some of the videos that came through in the 90s, which are quite stunning. But let's hear, Keith, something that you'd like to share about your work.
Okay, my work, it's hard to talk about it because it's hard for me to explain. I'm trying to become better at it, but essentially, I recorded sound, EVP, I heard voices. And then I took it to the next step and I recorded pictures in light. So some people, they just take bowls of water and they stir it. And in that reflection of light, they will see faces and images. It's quite a common practice these days, actually. And from then I said, if we can hear their voices and sound, can we see their voices and sound? And that's where it started to get a little different for me. And so first I would like to show you a couple pictures that were, 5 or 6 of these were taken a decade ago. The rest of them were taken within the last 2 weeks. Let's see. Wendy, can you see my screen?
Yes, screen's good.
Thank you. Now, this is very difficult to see. For those of you that can, there's a face, but I cannot see it. There's a face over here to the right, and this face is in sound. If I can describe it really quickly, sometimes you've seen on TV where somebody will say, here's a sound, and here's how that sound looks on a graph. All that we are looking at is sound that is represented as a picture. So everything in this was actually sound. And this is a picture from last week. This is streamed live 24 hours a day. So what I'm going to tell you is white noise, static, is energy. It doesn't matter if there's a radio broadcast. It doesn't matter if there's sound in the background. It's energy. If you place intent on that energy, amazing things can happen. And so I know this is going to sound outlandish. Some of you may have seen it. Some of you might not understand how it works. I'm still learning how it works. Essentially, people are creating their faces live in real time in sound on the computer. And I'm streaming that live to where any of you can watch it 24 hours a day. I'll explain that again in the end. If you cannot see it, there's a face over here on the left-hand side. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next one. There's about 20 of these. On the left here, we have a person. This picture on the right, if you can see my mouse, is exactly the same as the picture on the bottom left. Above it is a picture where I've made it a little bit blurry because of the technical challenges we're having momentarily. On the left is a person in a suit and tie, which is presented right here. On the left here is a face that did not form as well. I'm going to continue. On the left here, we have a face that formed reasonably well. For spectrograph images, and the way this worked was, I said, can we see faces and sound? We did experiments. Faces appeared. And then naturally, I said, how do we make this better? It's been 11 years now. And these are the steps that we're taking slowly to create television with spirit, essentially. I know it sounds far out, and it is, but that's basically what's happening. So as I describe the history of ITC, I focus on how important it is for us to understand energy. And I don't focus too much on the technical items, but this is the outcome. When you wake up every day and you say, I'm open to spirit, there's more to life than just going to work and doing everything else. Focus my energy. I want to connect with you. These are the types of things that will happen. This face on the left here is not very clear, but let me continue. That one is not the greatest. These leave something to be desired, but you can tell generally that the formations appear to be faces. Now, until they're perfectly crystal clear, I can't prove to the world, yes, they're faces. However, it's my prerogative to continue that work until such a time as there is no doubt. This is one of my favorite ones right here on the top left. And so we don't know exactly how they're doing it. We just know that they're appearing in sound, which means we're putting out the intent for spirit to communicate with us, and they are impressing their images on the sound. We don't know if they do it with machines. We don't know if they do it with their mind. All we know is that they are doing it. And what that means is if we're working with this method and they're showing their faces, obviously they support the method. From that, we can determine this is an effort that is not only desired by us here, it's also highly desired by the people in spirit. So for every one of us here working on it, there's 100 of them working on it behind the scenes, making connections, trying to help us out. And that is something that we often take for granted. Some of these are better than others. I'm going to go through them a little quicker. There's another very good picture here for me, for spectrographs anyway. One thing I want to mention real quick is that a lot of people will see different pictures at different times. This is hard to explain, but since energy is everywhere and everything is energy, no person is really wrong, right? We've started to find that when people look at these pictures over a period of time, or when you listen to sound, EVP, over a period of time, you will develop the ability to see and hear things that is a little hard to show to other people sometimes because they might not hear it like you do. They might not see it like you do. It's only when a person believes and they continue consistently that eventually that communication, you're pulling it down from heaven is what you're doing. You're reaching out to the heavens, you're grabbing it, and you're pulling it into physical existence here. That's what we're doing. That's what ITC is. And that's why we find it interesting. So if we received enough of these pictures and they were high quality enough, and say they were able to come through the radio consistently, then you have the two components for television. Something a lot of people don't know I'd like to share with you is the Metascience Foundation in the 1980s had a goal where they had people from government and people from all over the world, people of influence and money, had them come together, and their plan was to create a device to communicate with heaven. The people included in that group include John F. Kennedy, Dr. Martin King Luther Jr., everybody from Robert Kennedy to Jesus, to a lot of other evolved or personalities that we know and or aspire to. That if you're interested in that, just send me an email afterwards or anytime of your choosing, and we'll be happy to explain that a little bit more to you, but it's not all of it's available on the public web yet. This is one of the first pictures back in 2007 when we did our first experiments to see, is it possible? Could people show their faces in sound? And so from that, these are older pictures. As I zoom in, it's still a work in progress, baby steps. We're still in the infant beginning steps. This is what we're trying to accomplish. And so this is the part of ITC that once you start getting to a certain point, it's hard to explain to people because you need to present something to people in a way that they understand. Who are the faces? Why are they there? What do they want? And where are we going? And I will close with that. This is the future. And so not only is it just a technical thing where, okay, we're connecting with them, it's a spiritual thing where they're helping us learn about ourselves and the universe we live in. It's not as straightforward as we thought it was. Our thoughts matter as much as our actions. I'll go ahead and stop sharing now. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. That was an absolutely wonderful presentation, and it augurs very well for your future presentations. This is something that we've been talking about, that Keith is going to be able to take his work out into the world. He's doing fabulous work, the patience and the dedication of this man. And what I really love about Keith's work is that it's not just technical. He also understands the spiritual aspect of it and the need to be developing spiritually, which I